The scream tore through the healer's tent before the sun had fully risen, and Mira was already moving before her mind caught up with her body. Blood soaked through the bandages on the young hunter's arm, and his eyes had rolled halfway back in his skull. Around her, 2 senior healers stood frozen, arguing about protocol, while the boy's life slipped through their fingers. Mira did not argue. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressed both hands against the wound, and called on every technique she had taught herself in secret, late at night, when no one bothered to notice what the weakest Omega in the pack was doing with her time. The bleeding slowed, the boy's breathing steadied. When the senior healers finally stopped bickering long enough to look, the crisis had already passed. No one thanked her. No one ever did. Mira wiped her hands on her apron and slipped out of the tent before anyone could ask questions she didn't want to answer. She had learned, over 22 years of life at the bottom of the pack hierarchy, that the safest place to stand was in the shadows. Alphas did not notice Omegas who ranked as low as she did. Betas barely acknowledged her. Even the other Omegas, desperate to distance themselves from her weakness, kept their distance, as though her rank might be contagious. She told herself she didn't mind. Most days, she almost believed it. The pack territory of Ashwood Hollow sprawled across a valley thick with pine and fog, ruled by a council of elders who answered, distantly and rarely, to something greater, the Alpha Kings who governed the old bloodlines from their fortress beyond the northern mountains. Mira had heard stories about the kings her whole life, the way children hear stories about monsters under the bed. Powerful, untouchable, cursed, some said, though no one spoke the word too loudly. She never expected to see one in the flesh. The commotion started at midday, when a convoy of black-cloaked riders thundered through the village gates without warning. Villagers scattered. Guards scrambled into formation far too late to matter. At the center of the convoy rode a man Mira would remember for the rest of her life, though in that first moment she barely registered him as a man at all. He looked carved from something colder than flesh. Dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes the color of a winter lake just before it freezes solid. He wore no crown, needed none. The way every rider around him kept a careful, fearful distance told her everything about his rank. When he dismounted, the ground itself seemed to go quiet, as though even the birds understood not to draw his attention. This, the whispers confirmed within minutes, was Draven, Alpha King of the Northern Reach, and he had not come to Ashwood Hollow for a friendly visit. He had come because he was dying, slowly, in a way that no physician among his own people could stop. The elders received him in the great hall with trembling hospitality, offering food he did not touch and questions he did not answer. Mira heard the story secondhand, the way she heard most things, from healers gossiping, while they thought she was too busy grinding herbs to listen. 300 years ago, it was said, a sorceress betrayed by the king's ancestor had cursed the bloodline with a punishment crueler than death. Every Alpha King born into that line would live centuries longer than any ordinary wolf, but would feel nothing, no joy, no anger, no grief. No warmth toward another living soul. A king who could rule an empire and never once feel the weight of loving it. Draven was the latest to carry that curse, and it was killing him from the inside, turning his heart, quite literally, to something closer to stone than flesh. His own healers had exhausted every remedy in 3 centuries of trying. In desperation, someone had suggested the old legend, that only the rarest bond, an unshakable connection between a king and a mate his curse could not explain away, might break the spell. And so his convoy had begun a slow, humiliating tour of every territory in the north, searching for anyone whose touch might do what 300 years of magic had failed to do. Mira thought it was the strangest, saddest story she had ever heard, and she thought no more about it. Kings did not concern themselves with Omegas who ranked at the very bottom of a minor pack's hierarchy, and she saw no reason that would change now. She was wrong within the hour. An advisor swept through the healer's tent that afternoon, demanding every healer in Ashwood Hollow present themselves for inspection. It was, Mira understood later, a formality more than anything, a box to check before the king's convoy moved on to the next territory. She was ordered into line along with a dozen others, made to stand while a stone-faced woman in the king's colors studied each of them like livestock at auction. Mira kept her eyes down. She always did. Attention had never once brought her anything good. But the king himself had accompanied the inspection, standing near the tent's entrance with the detached patience of a man enduring a task far beneath him. And it was in that tent that fate, or curse, or something stranger than either, decided to intervene. A junior guard, careless with his blade during a training drill outside, stumbled into the tent with a gash across his forearm, deep enough to make two of the senior healers flinch. Chaos broke out immediately, shouting, someone knocking over a tray of instruments, the guard himself growing pale and unsteady on his feet. In the confusion, no one noticed that the king had stepped closer to see what the commotion was about, drawn perhaps by habit, or boredom, or nothing at all, since boredom itself required feeling he did not have. Mira didn't think. She never did, in moments like this. She simply moved, catching the guard as his knees buckled, guiding him down before he could crack his skull on the stone floor. Her hands found the wound on instinct, pressing hard, murmuring the same low, steady words she used with every frightened patient, Alpha or Omega or anyone in between. "You're all right. Look at me. You're all right." The senior healers, finally shaken loose from their panic, rushed to help, but by then, the bleeding had already slowed under Mira's hands. It was only once the guard was stable, once the danger had passed and her heartbeat had begun to settle, that she realized how close she was standing to the king, close enough that when she reached for a clean cloth, her hand brushed his sleeve. Skin met skin for barely a second. Her fingers, still slick with the guard's blood, grazed the back of the king's hand as she pulled the cloth free. She felt nothing unusual. To her, it was an accident, forgettable, the kind of brief contact that happens 100 times a day in a crowded tent. But the king went rigid. It was such a small thing that only two people in the tent seemed to notice at all. The stone-faced advisor, whose eyes snapped toward the king with an intensity that bordered on alarm, and Mira herself, who felt the shift in the air before she understood its cause. Draven's breath caught, audibly, for the first time in longer than anyone in that tent had been alive. His jaw tightened. Something crossed his Winter Lake eyes that had no business being there. Something that looked, absurdly, terrifyingly, like feeling. He stared down at his own hand, as though it belonged to someone else. "My king?" the advisor said carefully. He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked up, his gaze fixed on Mira, with an intensity that made her stomach drop straight through the floor. She had spent her entire life being invisible, and in the space of one heartbeat, she had become the single most visible person in the room. "Your name," he said. His voice was low, rough, like something unused for a very long time. "Mira," she managed, her own voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Mira of the Hollow Healers, my king." He said nothing else. He simply turned and walked out of the tent, his advisor hurrying after him, throwing one last unreadable glance back at Mira before the tent flap fell closed behind them. The senior healers stared at her, as though she had grown a second head. The guard she had just saved managed a weak, confused smile. Mira stood frozen in the center of the tent, blood still drying on her hands, utterly certain that something enormous had just happened, and utterly unable to explain what. She told herself it was nothing, a coincidence. Perhaps the king had simply been startled by the sudden contact, the way anyone might be startled by an unexpected touch from a stranger. That was all. Surely that was all. But that night, as she lay awake in the small room she shared with 3 other Omegas, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind. The way his breath had caught, the way his eyes had changed, the strange, raw look on his face, as though something locked away for centuries had briefly, impossibly, come loose. She didn't sleep much. When she finally drifted off near dawn, she dreamed of winter lakes and cracking ice, though she couldn't have said why. The summons came before she had even finished her morning tea. 2 of the king's guards appeared at the healer's tent, formal and unsmiling, and informed her, not asked, informed, that she was to report to the king immediately. The senior healers looked at her with a mixture of confusion and something uglier, something close to resentment, as though her sudden importance were an insult to their years of seniority. Mira followed the guards through the village with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no idea what she had done, whether she was in trouble, whether kings punished Omegas for accidental touches the way some Alphas did. She braced herself for the worst as she was led into the great hall, where Draven sat at the head of a long table, alone except for his advisor standing at his shoulder. He studied her for a long moment before he spoke, and in the light of the hall, without the chaos of the healer's tent around him, she noticed things she hadn't before. the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the rigid, controlled way he held himself, as though relaxing even slightly might let something dangerous escape. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man carrying something unbearably heavy, and doing it entirely alone. "Do you know what happened yesterday?" he asked. "No, my king," she admitted. "I only tended a wound." "You touched me. It was an accident." "I'm sorry. I felt it," he said, cutting through her apology like it meant nothing to him. "For the first time in 300 years, I felt something." He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, she saw something almost like desperation flicker behind his controlled expression. "I need to understand why." Mira had no answer for him. She had no magic, no lineage worth mentioning, nothing that marked her as anything other than the lowest-ranked Omega in a minor pack no one outside these mountains had ever heard of. And yet the most powerful man in the north was looking at her as though she held the key to a puzzle that had haunted him for centuries. "I don't understand it either," she said honestly. "I'm no one, my king. I'm the weakest Omega in this pack. Everyone here will tell you the same." Something shifted in his expression at that. Not quite a smile, but something close to curiosity, cool and careful, like a man examining a stone he suspected might be more valuable than it appeared. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "everyone here is wrong." He rose from his seat, and though he didn't move toward her, didn't reach for her, didn't do anything at all threatening, Mira felt the full weight of his attention settle over her like a physical thing. Whatever had happened in that healer's tent, whatever strange thread had connected them for one unguarded second, it was clear that Draven had no intention of letting it go. "You will remain in this village until my healers determine what occurred," he said. "And you will not leave my sight until I understand it myself." It wasn't a request. Kings, Mira was quickly learning, did not make requests. She left the great hall that morning, with her hands still trembling, and her mind spinning with questions she had no way to answer. Somewhere behind her, in that cold, quiet hall, an ancient curse had cracked for the very first time in 300 years, and the weakest Omega in Ashwood Hollow had no idea that her ordinary life had just ended forever. 3 days passed before Mira understood that her old life was truly gone. She was moved out of the healer's tent and given a small room in the guest quarters near the great hall, a room finer than anything she had ever slept in, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the Pine Valley. It should have felt like a reward. Instead, it felt like a cage with soft blankets. The king's personal physician, a sharp-eyed woman named Elowin, arrived each morning to test her. She drew blood, examined her palms under strange lenses, asked endless questions about her lineage, her mother, her grandmother, going back as far as Mira could remember. Mira answered honestly, though she had little to offer. Her mother had died when she was young. She had never known her father. She was, by every account anyone could find, entirely unremarkable. "There has to be something," Elowin muttered one morning, more to herself than to Mira. "The curse does not simply react to nothing." "Maybe it was an accident," Mira offered, not for the first time. "Maybe it wasn't me at all." Elowin gave her a look that suggested she had heard that theory and dismissed it days ago. "The king has been touched by hundreds of Omegas over the centuries. Healers, servants, even mates, offered by allied packs desperate for his favor. Nothing has ever happened. Nothing." She snapped her instrument case shut. "Until you." Mira didn't know what to do with that information, so she said nothing at all. The strangest part of those first days wasn't the testing. It was Draven himself. He sought her out in ways that seemed to surprise even him. He would appear in the corridor outside her room, under some flimsy pretext, ask a question about her recovery from the previous day's tests, then linger far longer than the question warranted. He asked her, once, what herbs she used to slow bleeding, and listened to her explanation, with an attention so complete, it made her forget, briefly, that she was speaking to the most powerful man in the north. He never touched her again, not after that first accidental brush of skin in the healer's tent. She noticed the way he kept careful distance, hands clasped behind his back, as though he didn't trust himself, or perhaps didn't trust her, to survive contact a second time without consequence. "Does it hurt?" she asked him once, when curiosity finally overcame her caution. "When you feel something, does it hurt?" He considered the question longer than she expected. I don't know how to answer that, he admitted. I haven't felt anything in 300 years. I've forgotten what pain is supposed to feel like, and what anything else is supposed to feel like either. When you touched me, it wasn't pain exactly. It was more like being struck by lightning while standing perfectly still. Overwhelming, terrifying, and I wanted it to happen again the moment it stopped. He seemed almost embarrassed by his own honesty, as though the admission had slipped out before he could stop it. Mira found herself, against every instinct that told her to keep her distance from powerful men, wanting to understand him better. The court, unfortunately, did not share her curiosity. They shared only resentment. News of the king's strange fixation spread through Ashwood Hollow and beyond within a week, carried by traveling merchants and gossiping guards, until it reached every corner of the Northern Territories. Omegas of far higher rank, daughters of noble packs who had spent years positioning themselves as potential mates for the Alpha King, arrived at Ashwood Hollow, demanding to know why a nameless, rankless healer had captured his attention instead of them. Mira felt their glares every time she crossed the courtyard. She heard the whispers, not even bothering to lower their voices, wondering aloud what tricks she must have used, what unnatural magic she must be hiding, to explain something that made no sense any other way. They think you've enchanted him, said Tomlin, one of the few people in the castle who still spoke to her kindly. He was a young beta, assigned to run messages for the king's household, barely older than she was, with an easy smile that hadn't yet learned caution. Some of the higher-ranked ones are furious. They came here expecting a royal wedding, and instead, the king won't look at anyone but the weakest Omega in the pack. I haven't done anything, Mira said, more sharply than she intended. I know that. Tomlin held up his hands in surrender. Everyone with eyes knows that. But people don't like things they can't explain, and right now, you're the biggest thing nobody can explain. She thought about that for a long time after he left. She thought about the way Draven looked at her, not like a curiosity to be studied, though certainly that too, but like something he was afraid to hope for. She thought about the centuries of nothing he had described, the loneliness buried under all that cold, careful composure. And despite every warning bell in her mind telling her to stay small, stay invisible, stay safe, the way she always had, some reckless part of her wanted to know what would happen if she stopped hiding. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. A week into her stay, the king summoned her not to be tested, not to answer questions about her lineage, but simply to walk with him through the castle gardens as the sun set behind the pine ridge. Eulowin had suggested it, apparently, as a controlled experiment, sustained proximity without direct contact, to see whether the reaction from that first accidental touch could be replicated or explained through gradual exposure. Whatever the intention, it didn't feel like an experiment to Mira. It felt like something else entirely. Tell me about your life before this, Draven said as they walked, hands still carefully clasped behind his back, before healers' tents and curses and kings appearing uninvited. There isn't much to tell, she said. I grew up here. My mother taught me healing before she died, and I kept teaching myself after. I never had the rank to be noticed for anything else, so healing became the one thing that was mine. You speak of your low rank as though it's a fact of the world, like weather, he observed. Not with bitterness. I find that strange. What good would bitterness do me? She asked. I can't change what I am. No, he agreed quietly. Neither can I. I've spent 300 years being exactly what my curse decided I would be, and bitterness has done nothing but keep me company through it. He glanced sideways at her, something unreadable in his expression. Perhaps that's why you don't frighten me the way everyone else does. You've made peace with a cage you didn't choose. I never managed that. Mira didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and they walked in silence for a while, the fading light turning the pine ridge gold and then gray. May I ask you something? She said finally, and you tell me honestly, even if the answer isn't kind? He nodded. Do you actually believe I can break your curse? Or am I simply the only lead you have left, and you're desperate enough to chase it no matter how unlikely it seems? Draven stopped walking. For a long moment, he studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. I don't know, he admitted. I have hoped for so long that I've forgotten what hope is supposed to feel like, the same way I've forgotten pain and everything else. But when you touched me, Something happened that has never happened before in 300 years of trying. That has to mean something. I refuse to believe it means nothing." The honesty in his voice startled her more than any royal command could have. She had expected arrogance from an alpha king, certainty, the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied anything. Instead, she found someone as uncertain as she was, someone who had spent centuries being feared and obeyed, and never once being understood. "I don't know how to break a curse," she said softly. "I only know how to stop bleeding, and set bones, and make people believe they'll survive the night. That's the whole of what I am." "Perhaps that's exactly what a curse like mine requires," he said. "Someone who knows how to make the broken believe they can heal." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understood that something had shifted between them that had nothing to do with curses or magic or centuries-old sorrow. It was smaller than that, and somehow far more dangerous. The quiet, fragile beginning of two people who had spent their whole lives unseen, finally being seen by someone who mattered. Behind a hedge of dark evergreen at the garden's edge, unseen by either of them, Eowyn watched the entire exchange with narrowed eyes, already composing the report she would deliver to the court elders before the night was through. Not everyone in the castle wanted the curse broken. Not everyone believed a nameless Omega deserved the chance to try. And far beyond the garden walls, in chambers Mira had never seen and would not have understood if she had, the same ancient magic that had cursed Draven's bloodline 3 centuries ago stirred faintly in its long sleep, sensing, for the first time since it had been cast, that something was beginning to come undone. The council chamber fell silent the moment Draven entered, though the silence did nothing to hide the tension already thick in the room. Mira had not been invited to this meeting, but Tomlin had warned her it was happening, and something restless in her chest had refused to let her stay away. She stood outside the heavy oak doors, close enough to hear through the gap where they hadn't quite latched, and listened as the elders of Ashwood Hollow and the king's own advisors argued over her fate, as though she were a problem to be solved, rather than a person in her own right. "With respect, my king," said an older beta whose name Mira didn't know, "we cannot risk the stability of your court on the word of a single unverified reaction. The girl has no lineage of note, no magical training, no claim to any bloodline that might explain what happened in that tent." "I am not asking for your approval," Draven said, and even through the door, Mira could hear the ice in his voice. "I am informing you of my decision." "Your decision affects more than yourself," Eowyn cut in, her tone carefully measured, the tone of someone who had rehearsed her argument in advance. "The curse is not merely your burden, my king. It governs the strength of your bloodline's magic, the protection it offers this entire territory. If this girl is not the true key to breaking it, and you disrupt the natural order of succession and courtship for her sake regardless, you risk provoking the curse into something worse than what we've lived with these 3 centuries. "You speak as though the curse could grow crueler," Draven said. "I feel nothing, Eowyn. I have felt nothing for 300 years. Explain to me what worse looks like." The chamber went quiet at that, and Mira, pressed against the cold stone wall outside, found herself holding her breath. "There are stories," Eowyn said finally, more carefully than before, "of curses that punish attempts to break them. The sorceress who cursed your bloodline was not a gentle woman, my king. If the bond with this girl is incomplete, or false, or provokes the curse without satisfying it, the consequences could fall on more than just you." "Then we proceed carefully," Draven said, and Mira could hear, even through the heavy door, that his patience for the conversation had run out entirely. "But we proceed." The meeting ended shortly after, and Mira barely managed to slip away from the door before it opened and the elders filed out, muttering among themselves, throwing glances toward the guest quarters where they knew she was staying. That night, she couldn't sleep. Eowyn's warning circled in her mind, a curse that punished failed attempts to break it, consequences that could fall on more than the king alone. She thought about her own smallness, her own uncertainty, and wondered, for the first time since arriving at the castle, whether she was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than she had understood. She got her answer 3 days later, in the worst possible way. It began as an ordinary morning. Eowyn had scheduled another round of testing, this time in the castle's private courtyard rather than the guest quarters, hoping the open air might yield different results than the confined space of Mira's room. Draven attended, as he had every session since the garden walk, standing at a careful distance, while Elowen guided Mira through a series of small tasks, holding polished stones said to react to magical presence, reciting old healing chants passed down through generations of Omega healers, anything that might reveal a hidden thread connecting her to the curse. Nothing worked, until it did. Mira was reaching for a bowl of water Elowen had asked her to bless with a simple protective phrase, an old tradition from her mother's teachings, when her sleeve caught on the edge of the table and she stumbled forward. Draven, closer than protocol demanded, caught her arm without thinking, the same instinct that had once driven her to catch a falling guard, now working in reverse. Skin met skin again, deliberately this time, for far longer than that first accidental brush in the healer's tent. The reaction was immediate and violent. Draven's whole body went rigid, a strangled sound tearing from his throat that was unlike anything Mira had heard from him before. His eyes, always so carefully controlled, flooded with something raw and unguarded. Not just feeling, but an overwhelming flood of it all at once. 300 years of suppressed emotion crashing through him with nowhere to go. He staggered back, one hand pressed to his chest, as though something inside him had physically cracked. "My king." Elowen was at his side instantly, but he waved her off, breathing hard, his other hand still gripping Mira's wrist, as though he couldn't bring himself to let go, even as his body reeled from the contact. "I'm all right," he managed, though his voice shook in a way Mira had never heard before. He stopped, staring down at his own trembling hand as though he didn't recognize it. "I felt everything, all at once. Grief, anger, something that might have been joy. I don't," he laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound. "I don't know how to hold all of it." Elowen's expression had shifted from professional concern to something closer to fear. "This is exactly what I warned against," she said quietly, though not quietly enough to escape Mira's ears. "The bond is real, but it isn't stable. If his body cannot process centuries of suppressed feeling all at once, it could kill him faster than the curse itself ever would." The words hit Mira like a physical blow. She had wanted to help him. She had never imagined that helping him might destroy him instead. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Tell me what to do." Elowen studied her for a long moment, some of her hostility softening into something more practical. "The bond needs to strengthen gradually," she said finally. "Controlled exposure, not sudden overwhelming contact. If we rush this, we may lose him entirely before the curse is ever broken." Draven, still catching his breath, managed a faint, exhausted smile in Mira's direction. "Don't look so frightened," he said. "Do you know how long it's been since I felt frightened myself? Genuinely frightened, the way a person should be, not the calculated caution I've mistaken for it these last 3 centuries. He shook his head slowly. "This is the most alive I've felt in longer than you can imagine. I would rather feel this and risk everything than go back to feeling nothing at all." "That isn't your choice to make alone," Mira said, surprising herself with how firm her voice came out. "If this could hurt you, I need to know. I won't be the reason something happens to you." Something shifted in his expression at that. Surprise, she thought, and something warmer underneath it. "No one has told me what I can and cannot risk in a very long time," he said. "I find I don't entirely mind hearing it from you." Elowen cleared her throat, breaking the moment with visible reluctance. "Regardless of preference, my king, we proceed carefully from here. Brief, controlled contact only, under supervision, until we better understand what we're dealing with." Draven nodded, though his eyes stayed on Mira a moment longer than the conversation required. Word of what had happened in the courtyard spread through the castle before the sun had set, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until it barely resembled what Mira had actually witnessed. By evening, the rumors had settled into 2 competing narratives: that the weakest Omega in Ashwood Hollow was destroying the king with dangerous, uncontrolled magic, or that she was the miracle 3 centuries of desperate searching had finally produced. Mira didn't know, standing alone at her window that night watching the pine ridge fade into darkness, which version frightened her more. She only knew that whatever she had started in that healer's tent a little over a week ago had grown into something far bigger than herself, something with the power to save a king or unmake him entirely, and there was no way to stop it now even if she wanted to. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, and thought about the raw, unguarded look on Draven's face when centuries of feeling had finally broken through. Whatever came next, she understood with sudden, quiet certainty. She was no longer simply a healer treating a curious wound. She had become part of the curse's unraveling, whether she was ready for it or not. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, one built around careful, measured contact between a king who had forgotten how to feel and an Omega who had never expected anyone to notice her at all. Elowen designed the sessions herself, insisting on control above all else. A single touch, brief, no longer than a few seconds, followed by hours of rest and observation before the next attempt. Mira found the process exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated, not physically, but emotionally, watching Draven's carefully composed face crack open, again and again, each time revealing another fragment of feeling that had been locked away for 300 years. Grief came first, and it came hardest. During one session, when her fingers brushed his for barely 2 seconds, his eyes filled with something so raw and sudden that Elowen had to call an immediate end to the test. He didn't speak for the rest of that day. When Mira found him later, alone in the castle's highest tower, staring out at nothing, he told her, in a voice stripped of all its usual control, about the family he had watched die over the centuries, while feeling nothing at their loss. Parents, siblings, allies, all gone, and not one moment of mourning to mark any of it. "I remember loving them," he said quietly. "I remember the memory of loving them, but I couldn't feel the loss when it happened. Not really. It was like reading about someone else's grief in an old book." He looked at her, something fractured and searching in his expression. "Now I feel it all at once, centuries late, and I don't know if that's a mercy or a cruelty." "Maybe it's both," Mira said, because she didn't know how to make it smaller or simpler than that. "But at least now you feel it. That has to count for something." He didn't answer, but he didn't pull away when she sat beside him either, and they stayed like that until the stars came out over the pine ridge, saying nothing, needing nothing more than the quiet company of someone who understood, at least a little, what it meant to carry something heavy alone. Not every session brought grief. Some brought smaller things, stranger things, the particular sweetness of fresh bread, which he insisted he had forgotten entirely, until one session left him standing in the kitchens at midnight, eating slice after slice, with an expression of open wonder that made the kitchen staff exchange baffled glances behind his back. The warmth of sunlight on skin, which had him standing motionless in the courtyard for nearly an hour one afternoon, eyes closed, face turned upward, looking so unguarded and human that Mira found herself smiling without meaning to. "You're staring," he said, without opening his eyes. "You look happy," she said. "I don't think I've seen that before." "I don't think I have either," he admitted. "Not that I can remember anyway." "Is this what it's supposed to feel like, this ordinary?" "I think ordinary might be the whole point," she said. "Most people don't get grand, sweeping joy every day. They get sunlight and bread and small things that add up to a life worth living." He opened his eyes then and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, though she didn't yet have a name for it, something warm and searching, and a little bit afraid, as though he couldn't quite believe the ordinary things were real, or that she was the one showing them to him. The court, predictably, did not share his wonder. Resentment among the higher-ranked Omegas had curdled into open hostility. Mira found her belongings disturbed more than once, small, cruel notes left where only she would find them, whispers that followed her through every corridor she walked. One evening, a noble Omega named Colette, whose family had spent years positioning her as a likely match for the king, cornered Mira in an empty hallway with a smile sharp enough to cut. "Enjoy it while it lasts," Colette said, her voice pleasant in a way that made the words underneath it feel worse. "Curses like his don't reward common blood. Whatever you think is happening between you, it will end the moment the elders decide they've had enough of this experiment, and you'll go back to being nothing at all, exactly the way you were always meant to be." Mira didn't answer. She had spent a lifetime absorbing words like that without flinching, and she wasn't about to let Colette see that they still landed somewhere tender. But that night, alone in her room, the words settled into her chest and refused to leave, echoing every doubt she had been trying to ignore since the moment Draven first looked at her in that healer's tent. What if Colette was right? What if this was nothing more than a temporary curiosity? A king, desperate enough to chase any thread of hope, and Mira herself was simply convenient, rather than important. She was still turning the thought over when a knock came at her door, and she opened it, to find Draven standing in the corridor, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I find that happens more often now, since I started feeling things properly. My mind won't stop turning over the day." He hesitated. "May I come in?" "Only to talk. I don't trust myself to be careful with contact so late, when I'm tired, and less guarded than usual." She let him in, and they sat by the window in comfortable silence for a while, before he finally spoke again. "I overheard what Colette said to you in the hallway," he admitted. "I wasn't trying to listen. I happened to be passing." Mira felt her face heat with embarrassment. "It doesn't matter. She's not wrong to wonder." "She is wrong," Draven said, with a firmness that surprised her. "I have been offered mates my entire reign. Noble Omegas, powerful bloodlines, women far better positioned to secure my court's future than you are. None of them made me feel anything at all. Not one. In 300 years, until you." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "I don't fully understand what's happening between us. I don't know if it's fate, or magic, or simple chance, but I know it isn't convenience. Convenience wouldn't undo 3 centuries of a curse this cruel." "Then why do I still feel like everyone here is waiting for me to disappear?" she asked quietly. "Because they're afraid," he said. "Change frightens people who have built their whole lives around things staying the same. But their fear isn't your responsibility to carry, Mira. It's mine, and I intend to carry it." It was the first time he had said her name without a title attached to it, without formality, simply her name, spoken like it mattered. Something in her chest loosened at the sound of it, some small guarded thing she hadn't realized she was still holding closed. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet," he said, something wry entering his voice for the first time since she'd known him. "I'm told I'm terrible at this. Feeling things. I've had 300 years of practice at nothing, and only a few weeks of practice at everything else. You may find me a very poor student of ordinary human warmth." Mira laughed, a real, surprised laugh that seemed to catch them both off guard. "I think you're doing better than you realize," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded settling over his features, and for the first time since his arrival in Ashwood Hollow, Mira let herself believe, just a little, that whatever was growing between them might be strong enough to survive everything the court and the curse still had waiting for them both. The old library beneath Ashwood Hollow's castle had not been touched in decades, and the dust that coated every shelf told Mira exactly how long it had been since anyone bothered searching its records for anything important. She had gone looking for answers on her own, tired of waiting for Eloin's careful, clinical tests to explain what was happening between her and Draven. If the curse had a history, she reasoned, then somewhere in the old records of the territory, there might be a clue about why an unremarkable healer, with no notable lineage, had managed to crack something 3 centuries of powerful magic users had failed to touch. Tomlin helped her sneak down after the household had gone quiet for the night, holding a lantern aloft while she combed through crumbling ledgers and half-rotted journals that hadn't been opened since before either of them was born. "You know, if the elders catch us down here, they'll have both our heads," Tomlin whispered, though the excitement in his voice suggested he didn't mind the risk nearly as much as his words implied. "Then we'd better not get caught," Mira said, already absorbed in a journal so old its pages had begun to crumble at the edges. It took hours of searching before she found anything useful, tucked inside a genealogical record, so faded, she nearly dismissed it as illegible. It traced the bloodlines of the Omega healers who had served Ashwood Hollow for generations, and near the bottom of a list that stretched back further than Mira had ever imagined her own family reaching, she found a name that made her blood run cold. Selene. The sorceress who had cursed Draven's bloodline 300 years ago was recorded, in faded ink barely legible with age, as having descended from the very same line of Ashwood Hollow healers that Mira's own mother had once belonged to. "That can't be right," Mira whispered, running her fingers over the brittle page, as though touch alone might change what it said. "My mother never mentioned anything like this. No one ever mentioned anything like this." Tomlin leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the faded script. "Maybe no one wanted it remembered," he said slowly. "If your family is connected to the sorceress who cursed the king's entire bloodline, That's not exactly a story people would want passed down at the dinner table. Mira kept reading, piecing together fragments of the story from records scattered across half a dozen crumbling documents. Selene, it seemed, had once loved a king from Draven's bloodline centuries ago, only to be betrayed and cast aside when a more politically advantageous match was arranged in her place. Heartbroken and furious, she had cursed his descendants to live centuries without ever truly feeling love again, a punishment as cruel and precise as the wound that had inspired it. But there was more. According to a fragmented note near the record's end, written in a different, more hurried hand, Selene's own bloodline had been cursed in return, by allies of the king she had wronged, stripped of magical strength and doomed to appear weak and unremarkable for generations, as punishment for the sorceress's vengeance. A suppression, not a natural weakness, a magical binding placed on an entire family line to keep them from ever rising to power again. Mira sat back on her heels, staring at the page, as though it might rearrange itself into something less impossible. If this is true, she said slowly, then I'm not naturally weak at all. I've been suppressed. My whole family has been suppressed, for centuries, because of something a woman I never knew did, to Draven's ancestor before either of us existed. That would explain a lot, Tomlin said quietly. Why the curse reacted to you and no one else. If you share blood with the very sorceress who cast it, maybe that connection is what lets you touch it in ways no one else can. The weight of the discovery settled over Mira slowly, reshaping everything she thought she understood about herself. Her whole life, she had accepted her low rank as simple fact, an unchangeable truth about who she was. Now she understood that her weakness had been engineered, deliberately, by magic older than she could fully comprehend, tied inexorably to the very curse she was trying to help break. She thought about Draven, about the raw, unguarded hope in his eyes every time she came close enough to touch him, and wondered, with a sudden cold dread, what he would think when he learned the truth. Would he see her differently, knowing she carried the blood of the woman who had cursed his family for 300 years? Would he see her as complicit somehow, guilty by inheritance for a wound she had never chosen to inflict? You have to tell him, Tomlin said, watching the worry cross her face. Whatever this means, he deserves to know. I know, Mira said quietly. I'm just afraid of what it changes. She didn't sleep that night, turning the discovery over and over in her mind, until the first gray light of dawn crept through her window. When morning finally came, she sought out Draven before her courage could fail her, finding him alone in the castle's private study, reviewing reports from his territory, with the same careful focus he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw on her face was enough to make him set the reports aside immediately. What's wrong? He asked. She told him everything. The genealogical record, Selene's betrayal, the suppression placed on her own bloodline as punishment for the sorceress's revenge. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, bracing herself for anger, for suspicion, for the cold, careful distance that had defined him before she ever touched his hand in that healer's tent. Instead, when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, something thoughtful and unreadable moving behind his eyes. Selene, he said finally, testing the name as though it explained something he had wondered about for a very long time. There are old stories in my own family's records about a sorceress who loved and lost a king of my line. I always assumed it was legend, exaggerated over centuries the way most old stories become. He looked at Mira with an expression she couldn't quite read. If her blood runs in you, then perhaps that explains why the curse reacts to your touch, the way it reacts to nothing else, a wound and its cure, drawn from the very same source. Doesn't it bother you? Mira asked, unable to keep the uncertainty from her voice. That I'm connected to the woman who did this to your family? You didn't do this, Draven said simply, any more than I chose to be born into a bloodline that wronged her first. We're both carrying consequences neither of us created, Mira. That doesn't make either of us guilty of them. He reached out, then hesitated, remembering Elowen's careful warnings about controlled contact, before letting his hand fall back to his side instead. If anything, this makes me trust what's happening between us more, not less. Whatever thread connects our bloodlines, it clearly runs deeper than either of us understood. Perhaps that's exactly why you're able to reach something in me that 3 centuries of searching never found. Relief washed through Mira so suddenly it nearly buckled her knees. She hadn't realized, until his acceptance settled over her, how much she had feared losing whatever fragile thing had begun growing between them. "There's something else," she said, remembering the fragmented note about Selene's original heartbreak. "If the curse was born from betrayal and heartbreak, maybe it can only be undone by the opposite. Not just touch, but something real. Something the original wound never got to have." Draven's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "A bond built on trust, rather than politics or convenience," he said slowly. "The very thing Selene was denied." "It's just a theory," Mira said quickly. "I don't know for certain." "It's more than anyone has managed to theorize in 3 centuries, Draven said, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something that looked unmistakably like hope settle into his features, steady and unguarded. "Whatever this requires of us, Mira, I intend to see it through. Not because a curse demands it of me, but because I find, rather inconveniently, that I want to." Mira felt her own heart lift in response, warm and hopeful despite every reason she had to remain cautious. Somewhere beneath the castle, in records no one had opened in decades, the truth of an old betrayal had finally come to light. But standing here, in the quiet of Draven's private study, with the morning light spilling gold across the floor between them, Mira understood that the truth was only the beginning of what still lay ahead. Something shifted after the discovery in the old library, a quiet, steady warmth settling between Mira and Draven that neither of them tried very hard to hide anymore. The controlled sessions with Elowin continued, but they had begun to feel less like clinical experiments and more like something else entirely. Draven no longer waited for scheduled tests to seek Mira out. He found reasons to walk with her through the gardens each evening, asked her opinion on matters of the territory that had nothing to do with curses or bloodlines, listened when she spoke, as though her thoughts carried genuine weight rather than simple curiosity value. "You've never asked me for anything," he observed one evening, as they walked the same garden path where their bond had first begun to deepen. "Not favor, not rank, not protection from the court's cruelty, though you'd have every right to ask for all 3. "I don't know how," Mira admitted. "I've spent my whole life expecting nothing, so I never learned how to want things out loud." "Then let me offer something before you have to ask," he said. "Whatever you want, within my power to give, it's yours. Rank, protection, a place in this court that no one can take from you regardless of what happens between us." Mira considered the offer carefully before shaking her head. "I don't want rank I haven't earned," she said. "And I don't want protection that exists only because of what I might be able to do for your curse. If I'm going to have a place here, I want it to be because of who I am, not because of what I represent." Something in Draven's expression softened at that, warm and admiring, in a way that made her chest tighten pleasantly. "I find myself agreeing with you," he said, "though I confess I've never met anyone who turned down an offer like that before." Their conversations grew longer, quieter, filled with small, honest confessions neither of them had planned to make. Draven told her about the loneliness of centuries spent ruling without feeling connected to anyone he governed, the strange isolation of being surrounded by people who feared him too much to ever truly know him. Mira told him about the particular ache of being overlooked her entire life, the exhausting effort of making herself small enough that no one would ever have reason to notice her at all. "I used to think invisibility was safety," she admitted one evening, as they sat together on a stone bench overlooking the valley. "If no one saw me, no one could hurt me, or judge me, or expect anything from me that I couldn't deliver." "And now?" Draven asked. "Now I'm not so sure invisibility was ever really safety," she said. "I think it might have just been a smaller kind of hurt, one I got used to carrying, so I stopped noticing the weight of it." Draven reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Their fingers intertwined, careful and deliberate, and though the contact still sent a visible shiver through him, it was gentler now than it had been in those first chaotic sessions, more like warmth spreading through cold ground than lightning striking all at once. "I think," he said quietly, "that I would rather feel everything, all of it, the good and the difficult both, than go back to feeling nothing at all, even if it's overwhelming sometimes, even if I don't always know what to do with it." "That sounds like real courage to me," Mira said. "It doesn't feel like courage," he admitted, something wry entering his voice. Most days, it feels like drowning very slowly, in the nicest possible way. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with an expression of such open wonder that it made her breath catch. It occurred to her, in that quiet moment on the stone bench with the valley spread golden beneath the setting sun, that whatever was growing between them had stopped being about breaking a curse a long time ago. It had become something else entirely, something that existed simply because it wanted to, independent of magic or bloodlines or ancient debts owed to sorceresses long dead. Not everyone in the castle shared their contentment. Eowyn, ever watchful, had grown increasingly troubled by the pace of their bond's development, worried that unmonitored, unstructured contact might destabilize the fragile progress they had made through careful testing. She raised her concerns to Draven directly, insisting that emotional attachment without proper safeguards could provoke the curse in unpredictable ways. "You cannot simply let this unfold naturally," she warned him one afternoon, cornering him in the study while Mira waited outside, close enough to hear the conversation through the half-open door. 3 centuries of suppressed feeling do not resolve themselves through evening walks and stolen conversation. The curse requires structure, discipline. Otherwise, you risk exactly the kind of overwhelming collapse we witnessed in the courtyard, but without controlled conditions to manage it. "I appreciate your concern, Eowyn," Draven said, his voice carrying the particular patience of a man who had heard the same warning too many times already. "But I have spent 3 centuries living by discipline and structure, and it brought me nothing but a slow, cold death. I trust this. I trust her. I intend to let it unfold the way it wants to, not the way your instruments think it should." "And if you're wrong?" Eowyn pressed. "If this uncontrolled bond destabilizes the curse before it's ready to break, and it takes you with it?" There was a long pause before Draven answered, and when he did, his voice was quieter, more certain than Mira had ever heard it. "Then at least I'll have felt something real before the end," he said, "rather than nothing at all for the rest of however many centuries I might have left. I've made my choice, Eowyn. I won't be talked out of it." Mira stepped away from the door before either of them could discover she had been listening, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to falling. She understood, standing alone in the corridor, with Draven's words still echoing in her mind, that whatever came next, whatever the court's resentment, or Eowyn's warnings, or the ancient curse itself, still had waiting for them, Draven had already made his decision. He was choosing her, fully and without reservation, regardless of the risk. The question that kept her awake that night wasn't whether she trusted him. It was whether she trusted herself to be worthy of a choice like that, made by a king who had waited 300 years to feel anything at all, and had decided, against every warning and every danger, that she was worth the risk of feeling it. The formal court gathering had been planned for weeks before Mira's arrival ever complicated things, a seasonal ceremony meant to reaffirm alliances between Ashwood Hollow and the neighboring territories, that answered, however loosely, to Draven's rule. Canceling it was impossible, without raising exactly the kind of suspicion the elders were desperate to avoid, so it proceeded as planned, filling the great hall with nobles, dignitaries, and ambitious Omegas from every allied pack in the region. Mira had not expected to attend at all. Her rank, by every traditional measure, placed her far below anyone who belonged in that hall, but Draven had insisted, quietly and firmly, that she stand beside him, rather than be hidden away in the guest quarters like something shameful, and though the decision earned immediate, visible outrage from half the court, he did not waver. "They will talk regardless of what we do," he told her, as they prepared to enter the hall together. "I would rather they talk about a truth I'm proud of than a secret I'm ashamed to admit." Mira wore a simple gown, nothing close to the elaborate finery worn by the noble Omegas around her, and she felt every eye in the hall track her the moment she stepped through the doors at Draven's side. Colette's expression, from across the room, could have curdled milk. The evening proceeded with the careful, performative politeness of court gatherings everywhere. Formal introductions and stiff conversation over food no one seemed to actually enjoy. Mira kept close to Draven's side, grateful for his steady presence, even as she felt the weight of 100 hostile stares pressing in from every direction. The trouble began during the formal toasts, when one of the visiting nobles, an alpha from a rival territory named Corwin, rose with a goblet in hand and a smile that promised nothing good. "To the king," Corwin announced, loud enough for the entire hall to hear, and to his remarkable new companion, whose lineage remains such a fascinating mystery to us all. He turned toward Mira with theatrical curiosity. "Tell us, healer, what noble house do you hail from? I confess, none of us can quite place the name." The hall went quiet, every eye turning toward Mira with a hunger for spectacle that made her stomach twist. She felt Draven tense beside her, but before he could respond on her behalf, she found her own voice instead, steady despite the fear coiling through her chest. "I come from no noble house," she said clearly, refusing to let her voice shake. "I'm a healer's daughter from Ashwood Hollow, ranked the lowest among the Omegas here. I have no title, no bloodline of note, nothing that would impress this hall." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the room at her bluntness, but Corwin's smile only sharpened. "How refreshingly honest," he said, though the words carried no warmth at all. "One wonders, then, what exactly qualifies a nameless healer to stand beside a king, when so many of us have spent generations cultivating bloodlines worthy of such an honor?" "Careful, Corwin," Draven said, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous that Mira hadn't heard from him before. "You forget yourself." "I forget nothing, my king," Corwin said smoothly. "I simply wonder aloud what the rest of this hall is too polite to ask. Is this truly the miracle everyone whispers about, or has 300 years of loneliness finally worn away your judgment?" The insult landed like a slap, and for a moment, the hall held its breath, waiting to see how the king would respond to such a direct challenge to his authority, and his choices both. Mira felt Draven's magic ripple through the air around them, something ancient and powerful stirring just beneath his controlled surface, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the moment everything could unravel. She reached for his hand before he could act, lacing her fingers through his in full view of the entire hall, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks ago from someone of her rank. The contact steadied him visibly, his shoulders relaxing by careful degrees even as the ambient tension in the room remained thick enough to choke on. "My judgment has never been sharper," Draven said, once he trusted himself to speak evenly. "For 3 centuries, I ruled this territory feeling nothing, and you all called that wisdom. Now, for the first time, I feel everything, and suddenly my judgment is in question." He looked around the hall slowly, meeting the gaze of every noble who dared hold it. "Perhaps the truth is simpler than any of you want to admit. You were comfortable with a king who felt nothing, because a king who feels nothing is easy to manipulate, easy to please with empty flattery and political convenience. A king who feels everything is far more difficult to control." The hall fell into uneasy silence at that, and Corwin's smug expression faltered for the first time all evening. "I did not choose Mira because of her bloodline," Draven continued, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "I chose her because for the first time in 300 years, something real happened between two people who had nothing to gain from each other politically. If that frightens this court more than 3 centuries of my suffering ever did, then perhaps this court has grown too comfortable with my suffering to begin with." No one spoke for a long moment after that. Corwin wisely chose not to press further, retaking his seat with a stiff, embarrassed nod that fooled no one about how thoroughly he had just been outmaneuvered. The rest of the evening passed with careful, subdued politeness, but Mira could feel something had shifted in the room, a grudging recalculation happening behind dozens of watching eyes. She hadn't won anyone over completely, she knew that much. But she had, perhaps for the first time, made it impossible for the court to dismiss her as simply an inconvenient distraction. Later that night, once the hall had emptied and the last of the guests had retired, Draven walked her back to her chambers, his hand still loosely holding hers, neither of them quite ready to let go of the contact yet. "You didn't have to defend yourself like that," he said quietly. "I would have handled Corwin." "I know," Mira said, "but I'm tired of letting other people decide what I'm worth. I wanted to say it myself, for once." Draven stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the dim corridor, something fierce and admiring in his expression. "You are the bravest person I have met in 300 years of living," he said, "and I have met kings, warriors, and sorcerers in that time. None of them faced a hostile room with half the courage you showed tonight." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to praise this direct, this genuine. "I was terrified," she admitted. "So was I," he said. "I simply hide it better. after 3 centuries of practice. But watching you refuse to shrink in that hall tonight, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before now. He reached up, gently, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, the contact sending its familiar shiver through him that he no longer flinched from. I'm not simply grateful to you for what you might do for my curse, Mira. I've fallen in love with who you are, entirely apart from any of that. Whatever happens next, curse or no curse, I need you to know that truth stands on its own. The words hung between them in the quiet corridor, enormous and undeniable, and Mira felt something inside her chest crack open in the best possible way. 300 years of a king's loneliness meeting a lifetime of her own invisibility. Both of them, finally, impossibly, being seen. She didn't have words adequate to answer him, so she simply stepped closer, resting her forehead against his, and let the silence between them say what neither of them quite knew how to voice out loud yet. Somewhere in the castle's oldest chambers, sealed away for 3 centuries behind wards no one living remembered how to fully read, the ancient curse shuddered violently in its sleep, sensing, with sudden and furious clarity, that the bond it had been designed to prevent was no longer a fragile possibility. It had become something real. And real things, the curse understood with cold, ancient certainty, could not simply be allowed to stand unchallenged. The ceremony marking the alliance renewal between Ashwood Hollow and its neighboring territories was meant to be a formality, the kind of grand public ritual Draven had performed dozens of times over the centuries without incident. No one expected the curse to choose that exact moment to fight back. Mira stood near the ceremonial dais alongside the elders and visiting nobles, watching Draven recite the ancient words of alliance beneath the open sky, sunlight catching in his dark hair as he lifted the ceremonial blade to seal the pact with a symbolic drop of blood, a ritual older than the curse itself. The blade had barely touched his palm when he staggered. At first, Mira thought it was simple pain from the cut, but the way his whole body convulsed, the way his eyes rolled back and dark, jagged veins began spreading visibly beneath his skin like cracking ice, told her immediately that something far more dangerous was happening. The crowd gasped and scattered backward as Draven collapsed to his knees, a low, terrible sound tearing from his throat that didn't sound entirely human. The curse. Elowen's voice cut through the panic, sharp with alarm, as she pushed through the crowd toward him. It's reacting. It's fighting the bond directly. We need to... She didn't finish the sentence. Draven's whole body arched, dark magic crackling visibly around him like a physical storm, and the nobles closest to the dais scrambled backward in terror as ancient, furious power began radiating outward from the king in violent, uncontrolled waves. Mira didn't think, she never did, in moments like this. She pushed through the panicking crowd before anyone could stop her, dropping to her knees beside him, just as she had dropped beside that bleeding guard in the healer's tent so many weeks ago, driven by the same fierce, unthinking instinct to help no matter the danger to herself. Draven. She grabbed his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her despite the violent tremors racking his body. Look at me. Stay with me. His eyes, when they finally focused on her, were nearly black, the winter lake blue, almost entirely swallowed by whatever dark magic was tearing through him. Mira, he gasped, his voice barely recognizable. Get away. I don't know what I'm not leaving, she said fiercely, refusing to loosen her grip on him, even as the dark magic crackled dangerously close to her own skin. I don't care what the curse throws at us. I'm not letting go. She pressed her forehead against his, closing the last distance between them, and held on with every bit of strength she possessed, as his body convulsed against the ancient magic trying to tear him apart. Around them, Elowen shouted instructions no one seemed able to follow, guards and nobles alike frozen in horror, unable to approach the violent storm of power surrounding their king. Please, Mira whispered against his skin, tears streaking down her face, though she barely noticed them falling. Please don't leave. Not now. Not when we've only just found each other. Something shifted in the air around them, the violent crackling energy beginning, very slowly, to still. Draven's ragged breathing steadied by careful degrees, the dark veins beneath his skin receding as visibly as they had appeared, retreating back into whatever ancient wound they had erupted from. When the last of the dark magic finally dissipated, leaving the dais eerily quiet in its wake, Draven collapsed forward into Mira's arms, utterly spent, his breath coming in exhausted gasps against her shoulder. "You're all right," she whispered, holding him tightly, hardly able to believe the storm had actually passed. "You're all right, I've got you." The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence for a long moment, before Elowen finally rushed forward, dropping to check Draven's pulse with hands that trembled, despite her professional composure. "His heartbeat is stabilizing," she announced, relief evident in her voice. "Whatever happened, whatever she did, it worked. The curse's attack has been repelled." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, shock giving way slowly to something like awe as they processed what they had just witnessed. The nameless healer everyone had dismissed and resented for weeks had just held back an ancient, furious curse with nothing but her bare hands and her refusal to let go. Draven lifted his head slowly, meeting Mira's eyes with an expression of exhausted, overwhelmed wonder. "You stayed," he said, his voice still rough from the ordeal. "Even when the curse was trying to tear itself apart around us, you stayed." "I told you I wasn't leaving," Mira said, brushing damp hair back from his forehead with a hand that still trembled from adrenaline. "I meant it." Elowen helped them both to their feet, still monitoring Draven closely, though the color had already begun returning to his face. "The curse fought back," she said quietly, once they had moved away from the crowd's overwhelming attention, because it sensed the bond growing strong enough to genuinely threaten it. This wasn't a random attack, it was a last, desperate defense. "Then we're closer than we thought," Draven said, still breathing unevenly, but with something fierce and determined entering his expression, despite his exhaustion. "The curse wouldn't fight this hard if it didn't fear losing." "Perhaps," Elowen said carefully, "but it also means the final confrontation, whenever it comes, will not be gentle. If tonight was a warning shot, the true reckoning will likely be far worse." Mira felt a chill settle over her despite the warm evening air, understanding immediately what Elowen meant. Whatever they had survived on that ceremonial dais was only a preview of something larger still waiting for them, something the ancient curse would not surrender without a genuine fight. But when she looked at Draven, exhausted and shaken yet very much alive, very much still looking at her with that same unguarded warmth he had shown her since the very beginning, she found she wasn't afraid of what still lay ahead. Not entirely. "Whatever comes next," she said quietly, taking his hand in hers despite Elowen's watchful presence, "we'll face it together." Draven's fingers tightened around hers, steady now despite everything his body had just endured. "Together," he agreed. "I find I quite like the sound of that word, after 3 centuries of facing everything alone." Around them, the crowd that had gathered for a simple alliance ceremony slowly began to disperse, carrying with them a story that would spread through every territory in the north before the week was through, that the weakest Omega anyone had ever dismissed had just stood unflinching against an ancient curse and refused to let it win. Whatever doubt had remained about Mira's place beside the king, that night on the ceremonial dais had begun, however slowly, to burn it away. Recovery took days, and Elowen refused to let Draven out of close observation until she was certain the curse's violent outburst had truly passed. Mira spent most of that time at his side, the careful boundaries of controlled contact abandoned entirely now in favor of simply being near each other whenever possible. It was during those quiet, recovering days that Elowen finally shared the last piece of the puzzle she had been researching since the ceremonial dais incident, poring over old records with a determination that had softened, gradually, into something closer to genuine investment in seeing them succeed. "I found more detail about Selene's original curse," she told them, spreading a set of ancient, carefully preserved documents across the study table. It wasn't simply a punishment born of heartbreak, as the fragments Mira found suggested. It was more specific than that. "Selene didn't curse your bloodline to feel nothing forever, my king. She cursed it to feel nothing, until a bond formed that mirrored the very love she was denied. One built entirely outside politics, entirely outside convenience, freely chosen by both parties, despite every reason the world might offer to keep them apart." Draven's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "That's exactly what's happened between Mira and myself," he said slowly. "No political advantage, no noble bloodline, nothing but genuine choice, made against the court's wishes rather than because of them." "Precisely," Elowen said. "Which explains why the bond has grown as strong as it has. and why the curse fought so violently against it at the ceremony. It recognizes the conditions of its own undoing forming in front of it, and it's trying desperately to prevent them from completing. Completing how? Mira asked. What actually breaks it, if the bond alone hasn't been enough so far? Eowyn consulted her notes carefully before answering. The old records suggest the curse requires a final deliberate choice, made fully and consciously, with complete understanding of the risk involved. Not an accident, the way your first touch was. Not even careful controlled contact, the way we've approached it since. A choice, made freely, to accept everything the bond might cost, in front of witnesses who can attest that it was chosen rather than forced. A public choice, Draven said slowly. In front of the court. Yes, Eowyn confirmed. And given how violently the curse reacted at the ceremony, I suspect it will not go quietly when that final choice is made. Whatever confrontation remains ahead, it will likely be the fiercest yet. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily over the room. Mira thought about the dark magic she had witnessed at the ceremony, the violent convulsions that had nearly torn Draven apart before her eyes, and felt fear coil tight in her chest at the thought of facing something worse. But beneath the fear, something steadier remained. The same fierce, unthinking instinct that had driven her to catch a falling guard, to press her hands against Draven's shaking body on that ceremonial dais and refuse to let go no matter how dangerous the storm around them became. She had already chosen him, in every way that mattered. The only thing left was making that choice visible, undeniable, in front of everyone who still doubted it. Then we do it properly, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. Publicly, with full understanding of what it might cost. Draven turned to look at her, searching her expression carefully for any trace of doubt or hesitation. He found none. You understand what you're agreeing to, he said quietly. If the curse fights this as violently as it fought at the ceremony, there's a real chance it could hurt you as badly as it nearly hurt me. Perhaps worse. I understand, Mira said, and I'm choosing it anyway. Not because a curse demands it, and not because 3 centuries of your suffering deserves an ending, though both of those things are true. I'm choosing it because I love you, Draven, entirely apart from any of that. I want to see this through, whatever it costs. It was the first time she had said the words aloud, and she watched them land on him with visible, overwhelming force, his breath catching in his throat, the way it had that very first day in the healer's tent, when an accidental touch had cracked open 3 centuries of nothing at all. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had spent 300 years unable to access. More than I have words to properly express, after such limited practice at feeling anything at all. But I mean it entirely, Mira. Whatever comes next, I choose you, fully, and without reservation. Eowyn cleared her throat gently, breaking the charged silence between them with visible reluctance. If you're both certain, she said, I would recommend we prepare properly before attempting this. The court should be gathered, formally, as witnesses, and we should have every healer and protective ward this castle possesses standing ready, in case the curse's final resistance proves as dangerous as I fear it might. They spent the following days preparing carefully, gathering the elders and nobles who had witnessed the ceremony's violent disruption, arranging protective wards throughout the great hall under Eowyn's careful supervision. Word spread quickly through the castle, and beyond it, carried on the same rumor networks that had once mocked Mira's low rank, now buzzing instead with anticipation for whatever confrontation still lay ahead. Colette, surprisingly, sought Mira out the evening before the final ceremony, her usual sharp hostility softened into something more complicated. I still don't fully understand why it's you, she admitted, standing stiffly in the corridor outside Mira's chambers. I spent years preparing to be exactly what a king like him should want, and instead, it was someone none of us ever bothered to notice. She paused, something almost like respect entering her voice despite herself. But I saw what you did on that dais. No amount of noble breeding teaches someone to hold on to a king, while ancient magic tries to tear him apart. Whatever this is between you, I don't think it's an accident anymore. I think you actually earned it. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer to acceptance than Mira had expected from her, and she found herself grateful for even that small shift. Thank you, Mira said quietly. That means more than you probably realize. Colette nodded once, stiffly, and turned to leave. pausing only briefly at the end of the corridor. "For what it's worth," she added, without turning back, "I hope it works. Whatever tomorrow brings. No one deserves to suffer the way he has, king or not." Alone in her chambers that night, Mira sat by her window and looked out over the pine ridge, one last time, before whatever the following day would bring. She thought about the healer's tent, about the accidental touch that had started everything, about weeks of careful contact and stolen conversations, and a king learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to feel again after 3 centuries of nothing at all. She thought about her own bloodline, tangled inextricably with the sorceress who had cast this curse, in a moment of heartbreak centuries ago, and understood, with quiet certainty, that whatever happened tomorrow, she was meant to be exactly where she stood now, at the center of an ending 300 years in the making. Fear remained, coiled tight beneath her calm, but so did something stronger, steadier, unwilling to bend, no matter how violently the curse might fight against what she and Draven had built together. Tomorrow, they would face it. Together, as they had promised each other on that ceremonial dais, and as they intended to prove, once and for all, in front of everyone who had ever doubted that a king's centuries-old curse could be broken by nothing more than a genuine, freely chosen love. The Great Hall had never been so full. Every noble family from every allied territory had gathered by midday, filling the hall with a tense, expectant energy that Mira could feel pressing against her skin the moment she stepped through the doors at Draven's side. Elowen's protective wards shimmered faintly along the walls, carefully placed to contain whatever violent reaction the curse might unleash when the final choice was made. Draven stood at the center of the hall, dressed simply, none of the ceremonial finery of the earlier alliance ritual, only himself, stripped of every formal trapping that might have made this feel like a political performance, rather than what it truly was. Mira stood beside him, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the hall must be able to hear it. "Are you ready?" Draven asked quietly, his hand finding hers in full view of the assembled court. "As ready as I'll ever be," Mira said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was true. Elowen stepped forward to address the gathered nobles, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. 3 centuries ago, a curse was placed on this bloodline, born of betrayal and heartbreak, designed to prevent any king from ever feeling genuine love again, unless that love was chosen freely, without political convenience, in full understanding of its cost. She gestured toward Mira and Draven standing together at the hall's center. Today, we witness that choice being made, openly and without reservation, in front of everyone gathered here. A ripple of tense anticipation moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, Mira caught sight of Colette watching with an expression that had lost every trace of its former hostility, replaced instead with something like genuine hope. Draven turned to face Mira fully, taking both her hands in his despite the risk of overwhelming contact, despite everything Elowen's careful protocols had once warned against. "I choose you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Not because a curse demands it. Not because 3 centuries of suffering have made me desperate for any solution at all. I choose you because you are the bravest, kindest person I have ever known, in 300 years of living, and because loving you is the first thing I have wanted, freely and completely, since this curse began." "I choose you too," Mira answered, her voice steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. "I choose you, knowing exactly what it might cost, knowing the curse will fight us with everything it has left. I choose you because you saw me when no one else in my whole life ever bothered to look, and because whatever happens next, I would rather face it standing beside you than spend one more day invisible and safe." The moment the words left her mouth, the hall seemed to hold its breath. For a heartbeat, nothing happened at all. Then the air around them began to crackle, dark and violent, exactly as it had on the ceremonial dais, but far more intense this time. Ancient magic tearing through the hall in furious, desperate waves. Draven convulsed, his whole body racked with the same terrible force that had nearly destroyed him before, dark veins spreading rapidly beneath his skin as the curse fought, with everything it had left, against its own unraveling. Screams and gasps erupted from the gathered nobles, several scrambling backward toward the walls, but Mira held firm, refusing to let go of Draven's hands, even as the dark magic crackled violently around them both. "I'm not letting go," she shouted over the roar of ancient power tearing through the hall. "Do you hear me? I'm not letting go, no matter what you throw at us." The curse seemed to respond to her defiance with even greater fury, dark tendrils of magic wrapping around them both, and for one terrifying moment, Mira felt herself being pulled backward, some ancient, furious force, trying to physically tear her away from him. She dug her feet in, gripping his hands with every ounce of strength she possessed, and screamed the truth of her choice into the storm, as though sheer will alone might be enough to anchor it. "I love him," she shouted, tears streaming down her face, as the dark magic howled around them. "I choose him, freely, completely, and no curse, 300 years old, gets to decide that isn't real." Draven, even through the violent convulsions racking his body, managed to lift his head, meeting her eyes with a fierce, unbroken determination, despite everything the curse was throwing at him. "And I choose her," he shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. "Now, and for however many centuries I have left, this curse does not get to decide what I feel is real. I decide that, and I choose her." The dark magic reached its violent peak, the entire hall shaking with the force of ancient power finally meeting its match, and then, all at once, it shattered. Not faded, not slowly receded, the way it had at the ceremony. It shattered. Visible cracks of light spreading through the dark energy, like ice breaking apart under sudden warmth. And then it was simply gone, leaving the hall in stunned, ringing silence. Draven collapsed forward, and Mira caught him, both of them sinking to the floor together, as the last echoes of ancient magic faded from the air around them. For a long, terrifying moment, he didn't move at all, and Mira's heart seized with fear that they had lost, that the curse had taken everything with it when it finally broke. Then his eyes opened, and what she saw there stole the breath from her lungs entirely. His eyes, always so carefully controlled, so guarded even in his most unguarded moments, were open now, in a way she had never witnessed before. Not overwhelmed. Not flooded with too much feeling all at once, the way it had been during those first chaotic sessions. Simply open, warm, and unmistakably, completely alive. "It's gone," he whispered, wonder threading through every word. "Mira, I can feel it, all of it. Steady, and mine, and I don't feel like it's going to break me apart anymore." He reached up, cupping her face gently in his trembling hands. "The curse is broken." Around them, the gathered court erupted, shock giving way to overwhelming, disbelieving joy. Nobles and elders alike, moving forward, to witness what 3 centuries of desperate searching had finally accomplished. Elowen dropped to her knees beside them, checking Draven's condition with hands that shook with relief, rather than clinical detachment. "His pulse is strong," she announced, her professional composure finally cracking into something like tears. "Steady, whole. The curse's magic signature is completely gone." She looked up at Mira with an expression of profound respect. "You did it. After 300 years, you actually did it." Draven pulled Mira close, and this time, there was no violent reaction, no overwhelming flood of feeling threatening to tear him apart. Only warmth, steady and real, settling between them, like something finally, fully at peace. 300 years, he murmured against her hair, and it took the weakest Omega anyone in this kingdom ever bothered to notice. To save me from a curse, 3 centuries of powerful magic never could. "I was never weak," Mira said softly, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. "I was suppressed, there's a difference, and I think, after everything we've survived together, both of us finally understand that." Draven smiled then, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. 3 centuries of cold composure, melting away into something warm and human, and entirely his own. "Then let all of this kingdom understand it too," he said, rising to his feet and pulling Mira up beside him, turning to face the stunned, silent crowd still gathered in the great hall. "Let it be known, from this day forward, that the Omega, everyone dismissed as the weakest in this court, is the very reason this bloodline's curse lies broken at last. Rank was never a measure of her strength. It never will be again, for anyone in this territory, so long as I rule it." The hall erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling into something genuine and overwhelming, nobles and healers and servants alike, celebrating an ending 300 years in the making. Colette, near the back of the hall, was smiling openly, wiping tears from her own eyes without any trace of her former resentment. Mira stood at Draven's side, his hand steady in hers, and looked out over the crowd that had once dismissed her entirely, now watching her with something closer to awe. She thought about the healer's tent, about an accidental touch that had cracked open a curse 3 centuries old, about every quiet, stolen moment since that had built, slowly and carefully, into something strong enough to survive even the curse's most violent, desperate resistance. She had spent her whole life believing herself the weakest person in every room she entered. Standing now beside a king whose centuries-old curse lay broken, because of a love neither of them had planned for, freely chosen despite every reason the world had offered to keep them apart, Mira understood, finally and completely, that she had never been weak at all. She had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to truly see her. And now, at last, the whole kingdom saw her too.